Hello and welcome. This is Lab 5, build your DB server and interact with your DB using an app. I'm Richard Golson, and we are looking at task 4, our final task for this activity, interacting with your database. In this task, we're going to open the web application that's running on a web server. We're going to open it in a web browser. This web server was created for us and has been configured with a web application on that web server that will allow us to connect our database to the web application and then allow us to interact with the database. So using that connection, it will actually create the database tables on the database that we've created here on the RDS DB primary. And then once we've connected it, it's created the database, then that RDS DB primary will synchronize with the RDS DB secondary to create the database on the secondary. And then anytime we do an update through that web browser with that application, that updated information will be sent to the primary DB and then the primary will then update the secondary DB. So let's take a look at this. So we can see that we have our primary DB here. And if you take a look at some of the details here, you can see that we use that subnet group, the security group, and it appears that the primary was created in US East 1A. One of the great things about using this high availability is it doesn't really matter which availability zone that the DB was created in because we've already configured the subnet group to define the subnets in the availability zones. And if one of our DBs fail, then if our primary fails, excuse me, then our secondary DB will pick up the slack. What happens in that case, RDS would detect that the primary is no longer accessible and will change the DNS records, remapping the private IP address that was assigned to that endpoint here. It will remap to the private IP address of the secondary. So it's really this endpoint that we're going to be sending traffic to, and that endpoint will route traffic to the appropriate DB instance. Let's take a look at this page here. We can see that we now have the details, the connection details for the master username, which is main, and the lab password, or excuse me, the master password, which is lab password. And then there's that unique endpoint. So that although some of that information is over here, what's missing here is the endpoint because this is unique to our DB instance. We'll be able to use the copy buttons. What it's missing is the name of the database, lab. And if we take a look over here, we can find some of that information over here. So besides the endpoint, if I go over to the configuration tab, I can see that there is that DB instance ID again. You can see that up here. And that is then followed down here by the actual database name. And that is consistent with what we see over here. And just as a reminder for the connection information, that information is again here. And notice that this endpoint, which is our connection information, includes at the beginning of the string the name of our DB instance, lab DB. All right, so let's go ahead and make the connection. Now, what I've done is opened the application web page. That is the application that's hosted on our web server instance. So I copied the public IPv4 address to the web browser and navigated to that. Notice that it's using HTTP in secure traffic, which is fine for this exercise. Note that it loads this primary page here. And then what I did is I clicked on the RDS page or RDS button, and that brings me to this page, which is, you notice the URL's changed. It now says rds.php. This is where I will input into this form page those 4 pieces of information, which will then be used by the application to interact with the database hosted on the RDS instance, and they'll be able to interact with it through this web application. So let's go ahead and plug in that information now. So I'll go ahead and use what's here. So master username, I'll go ahead and copy that and I'll pop that into the username field here. And then I'll come back over to this tab here. I'll copy the password and paste it in here. Notice that it hides the information. So copy and paste is a really great way to go here. I'm going to copy my endpoint and pop it in here. Make sure that it shows the endpoint information. That's good. It starts with LabDB. And then what I'll do is I will get the name of the database. I can get it off of here, but I want to show you that you can get it from this page here, configuration page. So I'll go and pick up the DB name here, copy that, and pop it into here. Now, one thing to remind you, this page and this page are pages that are served by the web application running on the EC2 instance. So before the DB instance was ever deployed, these pages were already available because they are hosted on the DB instance. Excuse me, they're hosted on the EC2 instance, not on the DB instance. And very important to note that that web server is available in the public subnet. So they're publicly accessible. And what we want to do is ensure that any interactions with the DB instance are only through the application server when we're using this. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and click on this submit button. And I want you to note that it's executing this specific command here. So that's essentially connecting to the DB instance and then porting into it the file that has been exported from a previously configured database. So basically, a database had been created, and then a file was exported from that. And now what we've just done is exported that database onto our RDS instance. And you can see now we have the address book for that. And if I click on this button here, you'll notice that all will load now is the database displayed here on this page. We can no longer go back to that configuration page from here. Now, let me go ahead and add a contact just to test that this is working. It's always a good idea to test. So I'll say new student, put in some information in here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, and then put in an email, new student at email.com. There we go. And I'll submit the query. That submitted or posted that address book entry into the database. And now what I want to do is test whether or not it can actually add and remove. So I've added something. Now what I'll do is I'll actually do the edit this time, and I'm going to change this entry and I'll make this capitalized. And hit submit query. And you can see that the edit works. And now I will remove the entry. Again, I'm testing to ensure that everything's functioning the way it's expected. Notice that the entry has been removed and it even confirms that. So now I know that I have deployed my RDS instance or my database to my RDS instance as per the specifications. And at this point, I could then go ahead and grade this assignment. So let's try that now. So let me go ahead and drag this over to give myself some room. I'll hit the submit button, hit the yes. We'll let that run, and I'll pause the video when that's done. Okay, so we're back and we can see our total score now. This is the 4 tasks. So security group created, DB subnet group created, DB created, and then the app is connected to the DB. If I click on my submission report, we can look at a little bit of the details. So we can see for evaluating task 1, the security group created. So it is looking for a security group, and it's comparing it up against the web security group for the ID to ensure that I've actually appropriately configured it. So the inbound rule is allowing traffic from the appropriate source. And so it gives me a success there that was created and includes that inbound rule 1 with the appropriate port number. So you can see that's all good. And when it evaluated task 2, the DB subnet group, you'll note that it found the 2 subnets that I had configured for the DB subnet group. And you can see that it compared them up against the IP addresses to ensure that, yes, I've got the 2 subnet groups with the appropriate IP addresses. This ensures I've got the 2 private subnets where I deploy the RDS instances. So that was completed successfully. And then we could take a look at task 3 with the database created, and it was able to show the endpoint, the DB subnet group that I used. And so that was successful. And then finally, with the web app being connected, it shows a web status, a 200 OK message. So it actually checked against that URL. And then the web app is connected and the address book table was found. So we have a success message there. So it's been connected and properly configured. That's important. We have to have both of those. So that was completed successfully. So at this stage, we've completed our lab. Everything looks good. And just as a reminder, what we've done in this lab is to actually build the multiple components for an environment that was pre-created. So when we began the lab, we started with this, with a VPC, with a NAT gateway, with a web server fully configured, with an application running on it. And then by the time we were done, we had multiple components, including a new security group applied to both of the RDS instances, a subnet group that spans private subnet 1 and private subnet 2, and then the RDS instance where we placed a primary in a private subnet. Either one of these would do. And then the secondary was in the other subnet. Finally, we connected the application running on the EC2 instance to the database running on the RDS instance using the configuration page. And once that was configured, we were able to interact with the address book. That's it for the lab. Thanks for watching. Enjoy.